Good afternoon, everyone. This is the fifth lecture of the Comparative Philosophy of Death and Dying. In a previous lecture, we finished reading the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the following three lectures, we will talk about the Book of Job. Now, in this lecture, we will talk about the first 8 chapters of the Book of Job. Again, this lecture will have 4 parts. In the first part, I will briefly introduce the historical context in which the Book of Job is written. The second part will talk about the notion of the divine, the good, and the evil in relation to what actually happens in the story. And the third part will talk about the notion of friendship in the biblical tradition, how they are portrayed and what kind of function they play in relation to the story. And finally, as usual, we will end with concluding questions that you can think about after reading these sections. So first part, introduction. The Book of Job is written in the 6th century BC, or before Common Era. This is up to question because there are many theories argue that the story was written even before that and then somehow it was adapted and rewritten in antiquity. But the common consensus of the argument is that it was written somewhere between 4th and 7th before Common Era. So they said that it's safe to assume that it was written in the 6th century BC. And also they assume that the author of the text is Moses, one of the most important characters from the Old Testament. Here's the picture of Moses according to Rembrandt. So you can see that the light is suddenly coming from inside the person rather than from outside. He's famous for receiving the 10 commandments from God and communicating to the people of Israel. The story takes place in the south of Edom, the kingdom of Edom in antiquity, which is equivalent to the present region, the going across the border of Israel and Jordan. So the kingdom of Edom is the bottom of this map. So you can see how the contemporary Israel and Jordan border is this kingdom of Edom is located. So the story takes place right outside the Israel. So it's something that happens outside of Israel. And as you will see, Job is described as someone the greatest from the east. So it's the eastern part of the kingdom of Israel, or the right outside of Israel. That's the story. The structure of the book has 4 parts, or sometimes people argue that there are 5 parts, but let's say there are 4 parts. First part is prologue, which explains the context in which this story takes place, and the second part is 3 cycles with the friends. So Job and his friends go back and forth about what's actually happening to them. So they go into 3 cycles of debate where they're trying to understand what's actually happening to the protagonist, Job, which is the huge chunk of the story. So the main part of the story is these 3 cycles of interlocutions between Job and his friends. Third part is a dialogue with God. So the conversation among humans spin out of the control and Job eventually turns toward God, who should have answered to his question. So that's chapter 38 to 41. Before that, Job goes into a kind of soliloquy, and some argue that the one chapter before this dialogue with God is actually the narrator. So there are some debates on interpretation of the end of the 3 cycles, or the second part of the structure of the Book of Job. But let's say there are 3 structure: prologue, 3 cycles with the friends, and the dialogue with God. And he ends with epilogue, which gives you a narrative of what actually happened in this story. Now, the middle 2, so the second and third part, which is the huge chunk of the Book of Job, is written in a poetic form. So it is a kind of poetic practice among the different characters, and they're speaking in poetic form, which kind of reminds you of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Epic of Gilgamesh was predominantly written in a poetic form, and you recite them, right? So that you get this emotional interaction with the characters. That's precisely what's happening in the major part of the Book of Job as well. Now, prologue and epilogue are written in prose. That is to say, they give you the sort of third-person narrative to sandwich the whole thing. Instead of like you throwing to this poetry, right? The Epic of Gilgamesh is immediately throwing these tablets, right? And then you're holding this tablet to participate in a poetic recitation. But in the Book of Job, it starts with this sort of overarching narrative that sets the context in which this story can take place. And it ends with the epilogue that also gives you the perspective of the narrator that can see the whole thing. So, in fact, the prologue and epilogue helps you understand what's actually happening in this story. And without these 2 parts, probably very difficult for us to understand the meaning of the whole book. Okay. So that's the structure of the book of Job. Now, there are many famous paintings or illustrations of the book of Job. In fact, this book is quite influential in the history of human literature, also art. So I'd like to introduce some paintings and drawings. And so this is a famous sketch of the book of Job or illustration of the book of Job by William Blake, a very famous English poet and a painter from 18th, 19th century. So you can see how Job in the right is going through this suffering, right? And probably that's his wife and his friends sitting right next to him and talking about what's going on. And Job is looking toward heaven to have a conversation with God, right? Another painting is a Russian 19th century Russian painting. This is quite a famous painting as well of the book of Job. So Job is sitting in ashes and he's just tormented from the suffering that he's going through. Now there are some inaccuracies. His friends standing looking down upon him. It's more a symbolic gesture. And also, I think it's just the same for many drawing of book of Job, that Job looks, he's toned down, but his skins look beautiful and he even has a hair. So as you'll see, this is not actually what happened in the story, but it is true. He's sitting in the ashes and there's a potsherd, right? The broken pots right next to him, and wife is probably sitting in the background. Okay, so that's the Russian painting of the book of Job from 19th century. And this is another famous painting from 17th century France. The title of this painting is Job mocked by his wife. This painting was made somewhere in 1625 and 1650, a very famous French Baroque painting from 17th century. I think that's a really good depiction of conversation between Job and wife, I think. I'll explain this a little bit later in this lecture. Okay, so the second section, divine, good, and evil. What about Job? So what about this character, Job? What happens in the story? Let's dig into the story of the book of Job and examine some allegories and symbolic meanings and moral concepts that we can draw from this story. Okay? So the book of Job starts with this narrative, as I mentioned. Let me read this, beginning of the story. There was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons, 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. Immediately, the opening of the story sets this protagonist of the story as the greatest guy. So the Job is the greatest man in the East. Why is he greatest? Because he has the wealth, right? He has 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, and 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants. So he has many employees. He has many properties. Well, he's one of the richest guy in the East, basically, right? Very successful. But also notice the characteristics of him as blameless and upright. One who fear God and turn away from evil. In many sense of the word, he was the upright citizen and the greatest guy, and he is morally good. He's a good man, wealthy man, and everybody looks up to him. And if you're going to work for a big company, hopefully your boss is like Job, right? Also, he's blessed with family members. He has 7 sons and 3 daughters. And what do they do? This is chapter 1, verse 4. His sons used to go on a whole feast in one another's houses in turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So he has both 7 sons and 3 daughters, and they spend time with each other. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would ascend and sanctify them. And he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This is what Job always did. So the family is very close to each other. In fact, there's no fight between them. And the sons always invite the daughters to come to their home for having dinner, feast. So you have this very good image of good life in Job's circumstance. He is wealthy and his families are close to each other. They love each other. And he is caring for the goodness of their heart. He's providing these offerings to the God so that maybe in case his children sin, they will be forgiven by these offerings. So in many senses, Job and his family are just perfect. So we can easily imagine the high reputation of Job and his family from the opening of this story, right? Also, the term that is often used to describe the character of Job is this term integrity. So someone who has moral integrity. His character is perfect, as perfect he can be in this life as a human being. So you have this term integrity. This plays an important role in the rest of the story. So keep that in mind. And then one day, this is verse 6, heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" The Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." So you have this God with the assembly of the divine beings or heavenly beings. In other translation of this text, they are described as the sons of God, but many versions actually translate them as heavenly beings. So there's a community or assembly of divine beings. And I think the best image of that sort of assembly that I can think of is this image of the inside Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, right? So there's many lights coming from different directions, and you have this God as if he's sitting there as this divine judge. Around them, you have heavenly beings gathering together. And Satan also came among them. Now, the Satan, or devil, is often described as this demonic being in many different cultures, right? You have different masks of the demon. If you play video game, we tend to imagine this character that becomes a boss, right? The evil that you have to conquer at the end of the game. You have this sort of shining eyes with crooked teeth or sharp teeth with this, dark figure. Or if you have the knowledge of the classical painting, this is Michelangelo's The Torment of St. Anthony from 16th century. So you have this sort of image of temptation or suffering that incurred by these monstrous creatures that can fly around. They used to be the angels, but they have fallen. So they are kind of dragged the saints down to the ground, to the hell. So you have this image of the devil. But in this context, the term, the Satan, that's the Hebrew term, means adversary or somebody who accuses or the someone who actually opposes the position. So in a legal term, and often this is the image that they used in a biblical tradition, he's the prosecutor. So the God is a judge, the divine assembly is gathering around him. The Satan, the someone who opposes and tell God what he thinks or challenges the divine point of view. Then God asks this question of where have you been, right? Where have you come from? That's really interesting because the Satan introduced this opposition or the evil or suffering, as you will see later. God asked this question of where does this come from, right? So it has multiple meaning in a question simply between two characters asking this question, but also the divine absolute is asking this question of where does the evil come from? The answer given by Satan is really interesting because he said, I'm just going to and fro on the earth. So I've been around, like just kind of going around your creation, just wondering about things. And then you can see God is really proud of Job. He said, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Have you seen the perfect man, the greatest man in the East that I have in my creation? So Job is not only the greatest man in the East, but also he is considered to be the perfect human being from the divine perspective. And then Satan's question is really interesting, right? He asked this question in verse 9. Then Satan answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? So Satan is actually asking the motivations behind Job's these behaviors. He said, don't you think the greatest man in the East is being the greatest man in the East because he enjoys the wealth and family and a reputation, and his integrity is tainted by the fact that the God provides him protection? He says this, have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hand, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. So he says, once you take away any of the things that you're providing him for his good work, once you take that away, he would immediately lose his integrity and his faith in God. Right? So his uprightness and his faith in the divine absolute would evaporate once he knows that he wouldn't receive these goods from his righteousness. Anyway, God agrees with Satan that he can test Job's faith and Job's righteousness by taking away his wealth and family and also taking away his health. It's interesting how the book describes two things the devil cannot take away from Job. God says, do not take away him, right? And do not take away his life. Spare his life. So we have to think about why these two things cannot be touched by the symbolism of evil. Yeah, you can take away family members. You can take away material possessions. Your wealth is gone. But you cannot take away life. So there's some sense of self, and life is a sacred. The evil cannot actually take away from a human being. So that's how the book of Job describes two things that evil cannot touch, which is person or self and life. Do not touch him and only spare his life. So we have to think about these two things. Why are these two things so considered to be the sacred, the evil cannot actually touch? Now, what is really interesting about the prologue is that it actually gives you a perspective. So the reader is given not only the perspective of what's happening to Job and the people going through this motion, but you also see behind the scene. That is the God and divine assembly with the Satan. The kind of agreement that sets the tone for what is going to happen, you provide it. But the characters inside the story, there's a clear division between the human and the divine. Remember the Epic of Gilgamesh gave these semi-demigods, or the gods walking around the city, and you can actually have a conversation. They're not necessarily great characters. Some of them are of limited capacities or limited visions, or they are evil. So you have a very murky image of the divine, but in the biblical tradition, there's a clear division between the human and the divine. And the divine side is talking about the goodness of Job, and then Satan comes in and talk about, no, these goodness that you observe in human beings are superficial. If you take away all these goods and profits, they would immediately crumble into miserable human beings. Anyway, in the biblical tradition, you have a clear division between the human and divine, but in the book of Job, you're provided with a perspective that can see both. So in a way, you are actually participating in this divine assembly and observing human beings going through this motion without knowing why they're going through this event. So the book of Job is structured in such a way that you are made to participate in a divine perspective that is comprehensive of the whole framework. So that's the prologue. Anyway, so God and Satan decide to inflict these evil or suffering to Job and see how he is going to respond to this, a kind of test. Is Job good for its own sake? Is he believing in the divine absolute for its own sake? Is his integrity something we can take away as we take away his wealth, family, or his own health? If he's going to live a miserable life, is he willing to trade his integrity and faith with something tangible like wealth, family, and health? That's the question. Now then, friends come from far to observe what's actually going on with the Job. But before talking about friends, the closest friend that Job has is his wife. His wife also lost her children, wealth, so she's going through the same tragic emotion as Job, and she says this at the end of chapter 2. Then his wife said, this is 2:9, do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So his wife tells Job, why not curse God and die? Let's keep that in the background and try to revisit the great loss that Job just went through. So let's talk about the great loss that he's going through, right? He lost his family, he lost his wealth. Well, let's think about this a little bit more, though. What is it like for you to lose wealth? Imagine yourself living in this beautiful house, right? Probably in South France or South Spain, villa, right? You have a swimming pool. Hopefully you graduate from college and you get a job that pays the rent, right? And hopefully you're not going to live in a small apartment, but you want to live in a big house with a pool. You might have to change your major from philosophy to something else, but hopefully you can achieve something like that, right? Imagine yourself financially very successful and you'll be able to live in this house. And probably you're going to meet some clients with this beautiful restaurant, with this clothes, right? And you have iWatch. Your life is great. But then maybe because you're a philosophy student, these big houses and beautiful restaurants don't impress you. So let's say you have access to this great library. You own this library as a part of your collection. You can read any books you want in the world. This is all yours. And then suddenly one day you lose all of that. In fact, the book of Job is not something that happened in ancient times. It is something that you can actually observe in contemporary society, especially while you see the huge gap between rich and poor. In fact, if you talk to the homeless people, they have the exact same experience. You don't have to go back to the ancient times. You can just walk around the city. You'll be able to see the book of Job happening around you. They lost everything. They don't have a home. They don't have a family in many cases. They don't have a places to go. And then Job is going to lose health because devil says skin for skin. People's integrity is superficial. They're capable of trading anything for their own life. So if you torture them with sickness, they're capable of giving away anything that you think is valuable, God. This is the image of someone suffering from leprosy or Hansen's disease. So imagine the guy sitting in a restaurant, handsome, good-looking guy, waiting for his clients in a beautiful restaurant, and then his health is completely rotten, at least at the superficial look. But this is the kind of image that the Job is going through, and he's scraping his skin off with a potsherd. Shave his head, he's sat in ashes. So basically, you don't have any room to breathe. Well, you're drowning in this misery and tragic loss. You can't even breathe with this succession of tragedy that you're going through. So with regard to the first two chapters, do not skim through the surface of the text, but try to feel the gravity of the situation. The difficulty of this is, of course, because the opening section is written in prose. So it's almost like informative. This happened. And then the rest of the text will be emotionally rich poetry or the scream of the soul, right? This guy is going through this most horrible time, and he's going to tell you how he feels as he responds to his friends that are actually trying to give advice to this guy who is going through this tragedy. But he doesn't lose his integrity. Something about Job, his sense of self and his life are sacred. They're not taken away. Satan cannot take away these things from him. He still persists in this integrity. Also, this is the most important passage from the chapter 1. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So Job basically says, anything that I have is given. The wealth, family, health, it's all given. These things are given, so I'm going to persist in my integrity. My faith is not taken away because I lost these things. And then Satan takes away the health. Now he's not only in emotional pain, but he's just going through this pure physical pain. His skin is like scraped off with this potsherd. I can't even imagine the pain he's going through. And then last thread of hope, his wife says this at the end of chapter 2. Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die. This is the title of this section. Why not curse God and die? Now, Augustine from later antiquity argues that the wife's perspective is equivalent to devil's perspective. So he describes the wife as an agent of the evil in this scene. But there are different interpretations, and I don't think that interpretation is necessarily true here. Because what do you think about her statement? Don't you think that's actually a reasonable perspective? Remember, Job doesn't have any perspective beyond the realm of the human. He just lost everything, and he's lost his health. What's the point of persisting in this integrity? What's the point of holding on to this faith when you lose everything? You know, if the faith doesn't provide you with the prosperity and goodness, what's the use of that? Don't you think that argument is reasonable? And perhaps that argument of reason, Augustine might say, is still in line with the Satan. But you can also read this as a kind of compassion too, right? Like, wow, what's the point here? I don't want you to suffer anything more from this great loss, and you're going through this physical pain. Perhaps wife's perspective is spoken out of her compassion. And I think one of the painting that I showed in the earlier part of this lecture actually depicts a little bit of that compassion. I don't think she's necessarily depicted as the evil that mocks the integrity of Job. But I think the wife who also lost her family members says like, there's no point in your life. Perhaps the best thing could happen to you is just to die. I think there are many different interpretations of this passage, but if you come from secular society or if you come from non-Judeo-Christian tradition, I think it's very possible for us to read this passage as the act of compassion. Then his three friends come from far, right? Now when Job's three friends heard all these troubles that had come upon him, each of them set out from his home. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They met together to go and console and comfort him. So 3 great friends of Job came from afar. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air upon their heads. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Remember these lines from the Epic of Gilgamesh? 7 days and 7 nights. It's very similar, right? Something about these 7 days and 7 nights from the ancient text gives you these rituals that participate in some kind of transformation or acknowledging some kind of transformation is always there. But anyway, 3 friends couldn't even recognize Job. He's changed so much. He was this greatest guy in the East, good-looking guy. He had many properties. He was wealthy, and he had many good family members, handsome family members. He lost all of that, and he just scraped his skin with a potsherd. So his appearance was beyond recognition, and his friends felt great compassion toward him. So he spent 7 days, 7 nights just sitting down. Remember the picture of his friends standing around in Job in the 19th century Russian painting? The picture is much more like a sitting, but I guess the painter wanted to describe this sort of a condescending tone that the friends actually have toward Job. So maybe that's why some of the friends are standing up. But in this scene, it's quite clear that these friends are sitting next to the protagonist. And then the chapter 3 describes Job's curse. He curses the day he was born. Doesn't that remind you of something? Do you remember the day the divine assembly declared to Enkidu through the dream that he was going to die? And he cursed the day he was born. Exactly the same way, right? So you can almost feel the ancient Sumerian influence on the biblical tradition. But here, clearly, something similar is happening. The Job actually wishes that he was never born, or he started to curse anything that led to this point. So there's similarity between Epic of Gilgamesh and the book of Job, but there's a great difference here as well. So let's take a look at what he says here. After this Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth, Job said, this is chapter 3, "Let the day perish in which I was born, and the night that said, a man-child is conceived, let that day be darkness." So you have this image of light as life and darkness as death, life and death in these passages. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it, let clouds settle upon it, let the blackness of the day terrify it, the night, let thick darkness seize it, let it not rejoice among the days of the year, let it not come into the number of the month. Yes, let that night be barren, let no joyful cry be heard in it. Skip to 3:11. Why did it not die at birth, come forth from the womb and expire? Why were there knees to receive me, or breasts for me to suck? Now I will be lying down and quiet, I will be asleep, then I will be at rest, with kings and counselors of the earth who rebuild ruins for themselves, or with the princes who have gold, who fill their houses with silver. Verse 18, there the prisoners are at ease together, they do not hear the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slaves are free from their masters. So Job wishes that he was not born. In fact, he wishes that he would be dead. He describes this image of death as a kind of equality that provides to anyone who is ranging from high reputation to low reputation, right? So the slaves and masters are resting together. Kings and princes are there as well. In this sense, Job actually describes the image of death as something peaceful, as a symbolism of equality to all human beings. Regardless of their social status, once they die, they will be treated equal in the other side of life, in the darkness. This is quite different from Epic of Gilgamesh, where Enkidu realizes that there's only darkness in death, and he's afraid of it. So he curses everything in life, but he wishes that he would not die. But in the book of Job, you have this clear image of embracing and accepting death as a peaceful or equality that you can enjoy, especially if you're going through this suffering. This is verse 20. Why is light given to one in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it does not come, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly, and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to one who cannot see the way, for whom God hath fenced in? For my sighing comes like my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. Truly the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I have dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. So the worst has come to me. Probably he's talking about loss of his family. Like, okay, I can lose all my wealth, but I lost all my hope, all my family members. The worst has come upon me, right? I lost my children. What's the point for me to live? The death is not worse than losing my children. That's what he's saying. The suffering that I'm actually going through is far worse than the peace that death will be able to provide me. After expressing his emotion about his life, friends come in. They couldn't keep silent anymore. They have to say something. In this lecture, we will take a look at the first speech of Eliphaz and Bildad. Remember, Job was beyond recognition, and the friends come in and they fall silent, right? Sometimes when your friend's going through great suffering, there's nothing you can say. So if you have a friend who just lost their family members, the suffering is so great that anything that you say is going to mean nothing. You know, if your best friend loses his parent out of nowhere, car accident, cancer, whatever you can think of, and then you have never lost your family member in your lifetime, and you're going to tell him or her, you know what, I understand what you're going through. Anything that you're going to say like that is going to mean nothing for the person going through that great suffering. So these friends are responding to this great loss of Job in appropriate fashion in the beginning. They recognize something really terrible has happened to Job. We have no words to describe or console this guy. All we can do is to be there for him, and we can just sit in silence next to him. And then this friendship represents a kind of reason. Remember the Epic of Gilgamesh described friendship as the cure of tyranny, emotional tyranny. Sometimes friendship represented reason. In the same way, in the book of Job, friends do reason with Job to understand what's going on. They try to actually console Job by giving a reason to what's going on. The first speaker is Eliphaz, and he is considered to be the leading speaker of the circle of friends. Toward the end of the book, God speaks to friends or talks about these friends, and then he predominantly refers to Eliphaz. So you see Eliphaz is providing this sort of a foundation in which all the other friends are going to make their arguments. So Eliphaz is described as the leading speaker that sets the tone for the entire debate between Job and his friends. The main thrust of his argument is often known as Retribution Principle. What is Retribution Principle? Or Retribution Theology, often called in religious studies or theology. What does it represent? It represents this worldview where God is just, right? So you have the creator of the whole world, or the foundation of the universe, as being just. So the concept of justice is integrated to this notion of the divine absolute. And because that just God created the world should also have the structure of justice. In other words, the world is structured in such a way that the righteous should prosper. They should receive the blessing, and also the wicked suffer from evil and destructions. So there's a kind of correspondence between righteousness and blessing, goodness or justice and prosperity, and then wickedness or evil and suffering and distractions that you're going to go through in this life. So there's a kind of worldview where if the creator of the world is just, the world is created by that divine absolute, and then whoever being just and righteous inside that world should receive blessing, and whoever wicked should receive suffering. So that's the image of the retribution principle. Now, this conception is often applied in the legal system. The goddess of justice is blind to the favors. It should be weighed according to the merits and demerits. And then hopefully any legal system will rightly distribute blessing and punishment. So if you commit a crime, you should be punished for the crime that you committed. If you did the right thing in this life, you should be blessed and you should prosper in accordance with the goodness that you provided in the world. right? So retribution principle is like the legal system. We want to create the world in which justice is served. So Eliphaz sets this retribution principle in his argument. So let's take a look at his argument and how Job responds to this argument and how Bildad adds his arguments to Eliphaz's retribution principle. So chapter 4. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered, "If one ventures a word with you, will you be offended? But who can keep from speaking?" So he's saying that, hey, would you be offended if I started to talk, but I can't really, keep silent. Like, I have to say something about this situation, right? Eliphaz says, like, I might offend you, but let me just speak. See, if you have instructed many, you have strengthened the weak hands, your words have supported those who are stumbling, and you made firm the feeble knees, but now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and the integrity of ways your hope? So basically he's saying that, look, you used to give all these great counsel to people. Remember, he was the greatest man in the East, so many people came to him to get advice. He used to give them confidence. He used to give them great advice when people are going through a difficult time. But when you go through a difficult time yourself, where did you lose your confidence? Do you think this is a really great way of advising somebody who has just lost entire family and a house? I really don't think that's a great idea, but that's how Eliphaz starts his speech. And then he sets the tone for the retribution principle. Think now, who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen those who plow iniquity and saw trouble reap the same. So the wicked suffer from the punishment, innocent is never perished. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed. The roar of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, and the teeth of the young lions are broken. Now lions are often used as the image of sins or wickedness. The strong lion perished for lack of prey, and the whelps of the lioness are scattered. So he talks in allegory. Now word came stealing to me. My ear received the whisper of it amid thoughts from visions of the night when deep sleep falls on mortals. And dread came upon me, and trembling, which made all my bones shake. A spirit glided past my face. The hair of my flesh bristled. It stood still, and I could not discern its appearance. Now suddenly Eliphaz says that I received these visions from the night from this undiscernible spirit. Right? So he's trying to be a little bit divine inspired. But do you think he knows what's actually going on? The reader is already provided with the behind the scene information. What's underneath this whole event? And then this friend comes in and said, I received the vision from this undiscernible spirit. Its apparition talked to me during the night. And then everybody knows that he's just, this is pretty much bullcrap. A form was before my eyes and there was a silence. Then I heard a voice. Can mortals be righteous before God, and can human beings be pure before their Maker? Even in his servants he puts no trust, and his angels he charges with air. How much more those who live in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed like a moth. Between morning and evening they are destroyed, and they perish forever without any regarding it. Their tent cord is plucked up within them, and they die devoid of wisdom. So he suddenly makes this argument that no one is righteous before God, so everyone should deserve punishment or suffering. Is this a good argument? It's a very strange argument, right? So Eliphaz's argument is the retribution principle. That is to say, righteous should enjoy blessing and prosperity, and the wicked should receive suffering and punishment. When you say something like that to someone who is going through suffering, the implication of the argument, in other words, what do you think is the implication of the argument to Job? Basically, Eliphaz is saying that if the retribution principle is correct, and I do think this is correct, he's saying, anyone who is going through suffering would have to be wicked. So by applying the retribution principle, he basically says that, look, the Job's situation can be explained that because he's wicked, he's receiving this punishment and suffering. But everybody remembers from reading this text, in the beginning, Job is described as upright and righteous. In fact, he is perfect man. And he's going through this suffering for no reason whatsoever, right? But Job's friends, as the wise teachers, want to make sense of the situation by applying this retribution principle to the life of Job. Eliphaz's argument starts with the application of the retribution principle to the specific life of Job, but also he uses this argument from this semi-authority. I received this image from the Spirit, and he gives the argument that nobody is righteous before God. What does that mean? If you apply that logic, it says that every human being should deserve punishment and suffering, right? Everyone is wicked before God, therefore everybody should deserve punishment and suffering. Do you think that's a good thing to say to somebody who is actually going through a suffering? Absolutely no, right? Then let's continue Eliphaz's argument toward Job. This is chapter 5, verse 1. Call now, is there anyone who will answer you? To which of the holy ones will you turn? Interestingly, the book of Job uses a lot of rhetorical questions. Rhetorical questions are questions that you ask, but you already know the answer. So it's meaningless to respond to that question. So a regular question sentence is something like this. If I say, has anyone read the book of Job? If this is a reading assignment, it's very likely that everybody read the book of Job, right? So in a regular sentence structure, if I ask the question, the answer is yes or no. But rhetorical question, has anyone read the book of Job? If I ask that question as a rhetorical question, the answer is clear that nobody has read the book of Job. And in fact, I'm quite angry that you didn't read the book of Job, even though I signed last week, right? So the question, rhetorical question, is asked in such a way that the answer is already implied. So rhetorical question is much more charged with a certain kind of feelings or emotions. And all these characters in poetic form employ this form of questioning. So chapter 5 starts with this rhetorical question. Kona, is there anyone who will answer you? Nobody will answer you. Let's go to 5:3. I have seen fools taking root, but suddenly I curse their dwelling. Their children are far from safety. They are crushing the gate, and there is no one to deliver them. So it's even become more insensitive for Eliphaz to tell Job about this image of the fool who lost his children. So you are the fool that lost children, and children are not safe from your iniquity. That's what Eliphaz is saying to Job. Verse 6, for misery does not come from the earth, nor does trouble sprout from the ground, but the human beings are born to trouble, just as the sparks fly upward. As for me, I would seek God, and to God I would commit my cause. He does great things and unsearchable, marvelous things without number. He gives rain on earth and sends waters on the fields. He sets on high those who are lowly, and those who mourn are lifted to safety. He frustrates the devices of the crafty so that their hands achieve no success. He takes the wise in their own craftiness, and the schemes of the wily are brought to a quick end. They meet with darkness in the daytime and grow up at noonday as in the night. Skip to verse 15. But he saves the needy from the sword of their mouth, from the hand of the mighty, so the poor have hope, and injustice shuts its mouth. So he said, look, God is just, so he should be always on the side of the poor and the weak and the just. Isn't it strange that Eliphaz's point might be right, but he's speaking to Job, who is precisely going through that motion and arguing against him that if you are righteous, God should be on your side, and God is the one who sets on high those who are lowly and lift those who mourn to safety. But that's precisely not happening to Job. If God approves you, right? If you're on the right side, Eliphaz continued to argue, verse 21, you shall be hidden from the scourge of the tongue and shall not fear destruction when it comes. Destruction and famine you shall laugh and shall not fear the wild animals of earth, for you shall be in league with stones of the field. And the wild animal shall be at peace with you. You shall know that your tent is safe. You shall inspect your fold and miss nothing. You shall know that your descendants will be many and your offspring like the grass of the earth. You shall come to your grave in ripe old age, as a shock of grain comes up to the threshing floor in its season. See, we have searched this out. It is true. Hear and know it for yourself. So take this advice, Job. The retribution is right. God is always on the side of just. What does this imply? Job is wicked and he deserves punishment. Just like all human beings deserve punishment. By the way, I received this information from this indiscernible spirit during the sleep, right? How does Job respond? Chapter 6, then Job answered, oh, that my vexation were weighed and all my calamity laid in the balances, for then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. So he's basically saying my confusion is heavier than all the sands that you can get from the sea. It's really heavy. I have no idea what's going on. For the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. So the arrows of Almighty are usually on the side of the just. So the divine fights for the blessed people. You have this image of Shamash helping Gilgamesh and Enki to fight against Humbaba. Remember that? There's a kind of image of the arrows of the Almighty. But Job is saying that they are actually in me. That is to say, the arrows of Almighty is just piercing me down and they were just killing me. Does the wild ass bray over its grass, or the ox low over its fodder? Can that which is tasteless be eaten without salt, or is there any flavor in the juice of mallows? He said, can that which is tasteless be eaten without salt? It's a rhetorical question again. No, you cannot eat tasteless food without salt, right? You have to put the salt to eat something tasteless. But what does he mean by this? He basically saying that your advice, Eliphaz, is tasteless. What you're actually providing me is just meaningless crap. Your advice is meaningless. Verse 8, oh, that I might have my request and that God would grant my desire, that it would please God to crush me, that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. This will be my consolation. He said, I'd rather die than going through all this. Like, literally, there's nothing worse than what I'm going through in this life, and I'd rather die. That would be my wish. Remember, Enkidu's curse of life is coming from his fear of death, but in the Job's case, he rather chooses death over life so long as his life is this miserable. Verse 11, what is my strength that I should wait, and what is my end that I should be patient? So what's the point of all this? And then verse 14, those who withhold kindness from a friend forsake the fear of Almighty. My companions are treacherous like a torrent bed, like freshets that pass away, that run dark with ice, turbid with melting snow. In time of heat, they disappear. When it is hot, they vanish from their place. So he's using this image of the melting snow that creates these torrents, but in time of needs, in time of heat, all this water disappears. The friends that are there for you when you are prosperous and wealthy, but when you actually need them, they disappear. These are like useless friends. So at this point, you can see Job lost not only his family and wealth, but also his friends. Such you have now become to me. This is chapter 6, verse 21. You see my calamity and are afraid. Have I said, make me a gift, or from your wealth, offer a bribe for me, or save me from opponents' hands, or ransom me from the hand of oppressors? Teach me, I'll be silent. Make me understand how I have gone wrong. How forceful are the honest words? So tell me if your retribution principle is right. I have no idea what's going on here. I have done nothing wrong, and I'm going through this suffering. And I know that I'm saying the truth. Nothing is more powerful than the honest words, he says. Also, he says this, terror has entered your heart, my friends. Right? You're afraid. What kind of terror is this? I think this will be one of the questions that I'd like to ask you later. What kind of fear Job is representing to Eliphaz and his friends? Right? He's a leading speaker, therefore all the other friends probably share the same. These friends became this melting snow torrent that disappear in time of heat. And you are afraid for holding on to this vision of the retribution principle and talking to me. What kind of psychology is Job providing here? End of chapter 6, verse 28. But now be pleased to look at me, for I will not lie to your face. Turn, I pray, let no wrong be done. Turn now, my vindication is at stake. Is there any wrong on my tongue? Cannot my taste discern calamity? He says, look at me. You afraid? You're not even looking at me. This is quite often the case. Remember the image of the homeless people that I showed in the previous slide? You would notice when you walk down the streets, it doesn't matter whether it's China, Japan, Europe, North America, South America, wherever you walk, you encounter the homeless people suffering from the loss. A lot of times, especially in the prosperous, economically booming zone that you are in, you notice the people try to ignore them. They try to not look at them. At least a majority of the people walking down the street try not to look at them. Try not to imagine that you will become like them. We are afraid of homeless people sometimes, so we don't look at them in their eyes. This is precisely what Job is saying, that I'm in that position and you better look at me when you're speaking to me. So this is precisely the situation you're going through. And he continues his speech in chapter 7. Do not human beings have a hard service on earth, and are not their days like the days of laborer, like a slave who longs for the shadow, and like laborers who look for their wages? So I am allotted month of emptiness, and nights of misery are portioned to me. My life is meaningless. It has become absolutely empty. Verse 5, my flesh is clothed with worms and dirt. My skin hardens, then breaks out again. My days are swifter than the weaver's shadow, and come to their end without hope. I have no hope in my life. Remember that my life is a breath. My eye will never again see good. The eye that beholds me will see me no more. While your eyes are upon me, I shall be gone. This meaningless existence that has a breath, like short time on earth, and I will be gone in a minute. Look at me, I'm just going through this suffering, I'll be gone. Verse 11, therefore I will not restrain my mouth, I will speak in the anguish of my spirit, and I will complain the bitterness of my soul. Am I the sea or the dragon that you set a guard over me? So now Job is turning away from Eliphaz to speak alone. So he's speaking to himself at this point. Eventually he realizes that his friends are not listening or that they don't really understand what Job is trying to say. So he's turned away from Eliphaz and talking to himself. In ancient philosophy, oftentimes soliloquy is a passage to talk with the Divine Absolute. So in a way, you're talking with your friends, you're talking with your family members, but you talk to yourself alone as a soliloquy has a passage to transcendence in ancient philosophical framework. So you can see Job is turning away from exterior to interior, from interior to superior in this format. So he's talking away from his friends and talking to himself, but also he's talking to God. When I say my bed will comfort me, my couch will ease my complaint. This is verse 13. Then you scare me with the dreams and terrify me with the visions so that I would choose strangling and death rather than this body. I loathe my life, I would not live forever. Let me alone, for my days are a breath. What are human beings that you make so much of them, that you set your mind on them? Visit them every morning, test them every morning. Will you not look away from me for a while? Let me alone until I swallow my spittle. If I sing, what do I do to you? You watcher of humanity, why have you made me your target? Why have I become a burden to you? Why do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? And for now I shall lie in the earth, you will seek me, but I shall not be. So in a way, Job is talking to his friends, but also talking to God here, right? And also talking to himself. Just look away. Please leave me alone and let me die. And then finally, Bildad joins Eliphaz's argument. And then you see, in a way, Bildad is much more intelligent and rational than Eliphaz. He provides consistent argument, almost in the manner of professor, right? Actually, it's almost like talking to a philosophy professor, right? Philosophy professor oftentimes have these logical capacity to construct argument and tell you what's going on. In fact, all these friends give you a constructive argument to try to make sense of what's going on with Job's life. And later God comes in and deconstructs the whole thing. So you have this constructive argument among the friends to make sense of the life situation. And Bildad is quite intellectual. So his position is much closer to philosophy professor than, pastors or wise men that try to give you a pastoral and life advice like Eliphaz is trying to do. So to close this section, let's take a look at the Bildad's speech. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered, this is chapter 8, how long will you say these things and the words of your mouth be a great wind? Does God pervert justice? Again, rhetorical question. Does God ever do something unjust? Answer is no. Or does the Almighty pervert the right? He said, no, retribution principle should hold because God is just. We cannot think that God is being unjust. If your children sin against him, he delivered them into the power of their transgression. Much more explicit than Eliphaz's implication, right? If your children died, they probably sin against God. If you will seek God and make supplication to the Almighty, if you're pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore to you your rightful place. Though you are beginning but small, your latter days will be very great. For inquire now of bygone generation and consider what their ancestors have found. For we are but of yesterday and we know nothing. For our days on earth are but a shadow. Will they not teach you and tell you and utter words out of their understanding? So he said, look, the individual human life has a limited lifespan, and it's because of this we cannot retain knowledge. Therefore, we have to read the books written by the past generations and accumulated knowledge from generations of our intellectual tradition. We will be able to understand what's going on in the present. And then he talks these images. So it's very intelligent speaker. Can papyrus grow where there is no marsh? While yet in flower and not cut down, they wither before any other plant. Such are the path of all who forget God. The hope of the godless shall perish. Their confidence is gossamer, spider's house, their trust. If one leans against its house, it will not stand. If one lays hold of it, it will not endure. So the wicked will perish. Bildad is following Eliphaz's argument, right? This is verse 20. See, God will not reject the blameless person, nor take the hand of evildoers. He will yet fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with the shouts of joy. Those who hate you will be clothed with shame, and the tent of the wicked will be no more. So, very concise, rational argument. Bildad just sides Eliphaz. Nope, retribution principle is correct. If this is correct, evil should suffer punishment. The righteous receive blessing because you're suffering. Therefore, you're wicked. So, correct your way, Job, and you should be receiving blessing in no time. And Job's response is the same. I do not understand what's going on. I'm confident I'm on the side of the right. And in fact, I'm bringing terror to your life. So that's the end of our reading assignment. So let's take a look at the concluding questions. First question, why Job says that his friends are afraid of him? Again, this is the kind of the question I like to ask you. What's the terror? What's the kind of certainty or assurance that the friends want to have in their lives, especially by holding on to the retribution principle? What does the retribution principle provide as a basis of their confidence and sense of certainty? And why is Job's life that went from the prosperity and hype in the life of Priam in ancient Troy, right? Then everything went to toilet, right? What does that fall of Job's life represent? And what kind of fear, what kind of terror is he recognizing in his friends from sitting next to this person who is going through the greatest suffering for 7 days and 7 nights? So that's the first question. What kind of terror has entered the hearts of his friends? Second question, what constitutes friendship? We have seen the concept of friendship more positively portrayed in the Epic of Gilgamesh and how he played the significant role for introducing the notion of death. Because your friend died, you started to fear your own death. And I think friendship plays similar role here as well, that it represents reason, it represents the ways in which the terror can enter your heart. But also there are great differences. It seems that Job not only lost his wealth and health and family, he lost his friendship as well, right? And he described his friends as the torrent beds made by melting snow that rapidly appears and then disappears. So I think there's some similarities between two stories, but there are some differences. So I'd like you to make this comparative reflection with regard to the notion of friendship. Third question, is Job's wife right about the whole situation? Once again, Augustine describes Job's wife as the agent of the evil spirit. So he reads her as much more on the side of the devil. But the devil is also accuser, the rational opposition to God's point of view. In fact, she seemed to be a rational person in this story that, Job, it really doesn't make sense for you to be a faithful person in the face of the hardship. Don't you think that she's speaking out of compassion? Maybe the consolation to your life is death. Why don't you just let this integrity go and pass away to the other side? Your life is much more peaceful on the other side. As Job acknowledged, the death can bring the peace and equality to human life. So maybe wife is saying something reasonable and true in this story. Maybe Augustine's misogynistic picture of wife might be corrected by our interpretation of this wife's position. So I'd like to hear what you think about this wife's statement that curse God and die. Is this spoken out of compassion or spoken out of evil spirit? Lastly, this is the most important philosophical question that you should ask, and it will be asked in the rest of the book. Is retribution principle right? Why or why not? We do hope, and we do sometimes see the goodness prosper in this world and the wicked will be punished. Augustine is right. He says in a confession, distorted mind is its own punishment. When you do something wrong, you distort your own mind, and that distortion, self-distortion or self-infliction is the concept of sin in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So what is destroying you by doing something wrong is yourself corrupting your way of thinking and causing disorder inside your soul, according to the ancient tradition. So the tyranny is its own punishment in a way. Retribution principle, to some extent, I think it holds. In certain circumstances, retribution principle can make sense. But the book of Job is definitely presenting the case that retribution principle doesn't work. And also, Retribution Principle seems to providing some kind of confidence or sense of certainty to the wisdom of three friends. So we have to think about this for the rest of the book, but I like to set this question at the end of this first lecture, and then I'd like you to think about it as you read through this text. I have to say, this story goes really fast, just like the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a poetry, so it's very short reading. If you read this with the audiobook, it's like less than 10 minutes, 15 minutes top. So you can go through the story very quickly, but it's packed with images, implications, and symbolisms, and even some principles and conceptions, and theological debate and philosophical debate. So it's easy to miss some of the symbolisms and concepts in this book of Job. So make sure to go back and reread some of the things that you might have missed. Even though this lecture might be short, this does not mean that the content is less dense. So make sure to go back to the text and try to pick up some of the symbolisms and ask questions as you read this text. And also, I encourage you to read forward and backward. The typical reading assignment for the textbook is that you read the section and then you remember that section and you take the exam. But in philosophy, it's important that you read the background and the foreground and read back and forth and read more than once to understand what's actually going on and get the image or the comprehensive picture of the whole thing. So I encourage you to keep reading and keep reading forward and come back to this lecture and maybe add your own reading to this interpretation, and then you'll be able to understand what's going on in this text. Okay, on that note, I'd like to finish this lecture. Thanks for listening to this lecture to the end. We shall see where this story takes us next. And I'm looking forward to discussing ideas with you as usual. And have a nice weekend and see you next time.